Why is the United States spending billions of dollars arresting, imprisoning, and deporting drug dealers and drug users? In Deported, I argue that mass deportation of men of color is a U.S. policy response designed to relocate surplus labor to the periphery and to keep labor in the United States compliant. The U.S. public accepts this response because it targets mainly immigrant men of color who are perceived to be expendable in the current economy and unwanted in the broader society. Although President Obama has claimed his policies focus on deporting felons, not families, the numbers tell us otherwise. Many deportees are people like Eric, picked up through programs designed to locate criminal aliens, yet who have never been convicted of a crime. Nearly 2/3 of the deportations since Obama took office involved either people with no criminal records or those convicted of minor crimes. Minor crimes include traffic offenses and marijuana possession. Although in common parlance we don't refer to people with speeding tickets as criminals, these residents of the United States are often deported and recorded as criminal aliens. Mass deportation has happened primarily because the federal government spends billions of dollars each year on immigration law enforcement. The primary agency responsible for deportations is the Department of Homeland Security, which is charged with keeping America safe. Notably, fully half of the DHS annual budget, or $30 billion a year, goes to immigration law enforcement, even though there's very little evidence that mass deportation is making us safer. The primary mission of the DHS is to protect the country from terrorist attacks. It's hard to see how deporting Mexican gardeners, Guatemalan farm workers, and Dominican bodega workers is keeping us safe. In the same year that the United States deported 200,000 Mexicans and 30,000 Guatemalans, we deported 55 Iranians, 54 Iraqis, 48 Syrians, and 21 Sudanese. We're not deporting people to countries the government has defined as sponsors of terrorism. We are deporting people to countries with which we have strong and amicable relations. Instead of making us safer, mass deportation tears families apart and prevents immigrants from applying for legalization or citizenship, even when they qualify. Enhanced deportation tactics are increasingly deporting people with strong ties to the United States. One of the most pernicious consequences of this is there are currently 5,000 children in foster care whose parents are either in immigration detention or who have been deported. Deportation involves arrest, detention, and forced removal. Throughout the history of the United States, communities, especially those deemed to be non-white, have been subjected to these forms of repression. It is hard to imagine the United States would allow these detention centers to flourish if the detainees were primarily white. The dehumanization of people of color seems to be a necessary prerequisite for these repressive practices. Instead of detaining and deporting fathers, brothers, and community members, the United States claims to be detaining and deporting criminals, terrorists, and illegal aliens. The racialized consequences of mass deportation are undeniable. Mass deportation has disparate consequences for different racial groups in the United States. Moreover, it maintains a system of global apartheid, where the relatively rich and largely white of the world are generally free to travel and live wherever they would like and to access the resources they need. Meanwhile, the relatively poor and largely non-white are typically forced to subsist in places where they don't have enough resources. Mass deportation helps to maintain this system of global apartheid by removing mostly non-white people from the United States, a land of plenty, to much poorer nations where most people are not white. Global apartheid is part of the larger system of global capitalism. The role of the United States in the maintenance of global apartheid is a continuation of the United States' long history of racist oppression. The United States has a long history of marginalizing people deemed to be other. This othering justified the mass internment of the Japanese, the enslavement of Africans and African Americans, and the mass repatriation of Mexicans in the 1930s. Insofar as the public perceives deportees as members of undesirable groups, it applauds their removal. As much as many Americans would like to think we have buried racially discriminatory episodes deep in our history, Contemporary mass deportation proves otherwise. Mass deportation primarily affects non-white people. Mass deportation is carried out without due process. It separates millions of people from their families, and it's on par with racially tainted tragedies in our history, such as Indian boarding schools, internment camps for Japanese, and Jim Crow laws that denied equal opportunities to African Americans. Like these travesties, deportation laws primarily affect one group of people. More than 97% of people deported in 2012 were Caribbean or Latin American immigrants, even though they only account for 60% of all non-citizens. Many of these deportees are people like Eric. They barely know the countries to which they are deported, and they face police brutality, gang violence, homelessness, and a life of deprivation and isolation in their home countries. Mass deportation is only possible because of the current moment in global capitalism, where goods flow relatively freely across borders, while people face tremendous restrictions. The prosperity of the richer countries depends on these border restrictions. The acceptance of these restrictions by people in the United States relies on racist and nativist logics. However, if it is true, as Dr. Martin Luther King famously stated, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice, then this global apartheid that makes mass deportation possible is unsustainable. Thank you.